Doing virtual author events here. Want to make sure we hit this, so we're recording tonight's event. We've been doing these virtual events since about April of last year, and I think we're getting close to having done 200 of these virtual chats in that time, and it's been a wonderful way to stay connected with all of you, and also a wonderful way for us to obviously stay connected with authors, but also meet some new folks and have these conversations and kind of pairing up people in ways that we may never have been able to do in an in-person format. So there are certainly some benefits to this scenario that we're in right now, but I look forward to at some point getting back to doing some in-person things. And I will mention, we do have one really exciting in-person event coming up. It'll be an outdoor event. It'll be on the Guthrie Green, right across from the Woody Guthrie Museum here in Tulsa, right down the street from the bookstore. And we're going to be doing an event on September 7th. That's a week from tomorrow, with the U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo for her new memoir called Poet Warrior. And she will be in conversation about that. And we'll have all the books will be pre-signed, of course, but you can pick up a copy. That's the day the book comes out. So it's the official book launch celebration for Joy. So I would encourage you to bring a chair, bring a blanket, pack a picnic, whatever you want to do, and come spend some safe, fun time with us out on the lawn, on the green, and hear one of our great poets that night. So that's coming up. And then a lot of other things coming up in the fall. We have events with Anita Hill. We have Sandra Cisneros for the first work of fiction she's done in many, many years. A lot of stuff. So I would encourage you to go to our website. You can get tickets for many of those events there, or see more details at magiccitybooks.com, and you can find out all that's coming up there. Really excited for this event. Like I mentioned, we've had the opportunity over the last year and a half to have some really amazing what I call dynamic duos of authors paired up, and I've had the chance to know Mary Jo Bang a little bit because we were able to do a really fun event many years ago for the first book in this project, this Dante translation project, which Mary Jo took on in this behemoth task when Inferno came out, and have stayed in touch somewhat ever since. And when the new book was coming out, Purgatorio, I wanted to do something, and she had this amazing idea to have a conversation with the great Francine Prose. Now, I will say, if you don't know Mary Jo's work, as I mentioned, she's been working on this wonderful translation of Dante's works, which are kind of unlike any translations you've read of these before, but also just an amazing writer and poet. Won the National Book Critics Circle Award for her wonderful collection Elegy, teaches at Washington University in St. Louis, and I couldn't say more good things about her. And Francine Prose is just someone I've been reading forever, and is in both in her nonfiction work and her fiction work, is someone who I see, just new things from every time. And this new novel, The Vixen, which is a kind of a fictional historical take on the story of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and looking at the Cold War, from that to The Blue Angel to Mr. Monkey, and of course, Reading Like a Writer, which kind of changed my life when I read it. All of these things have added up to this body of work that's even greater than the sum of its parts. So to have Francine and Mary Jo in conversation about their two wonderful new books is going to be something really special. So before we jump into that, I would like you to all to take some time to ask some questions, put those into the Q&A. In the last 15 minutes or so of this conversation, we'll pull some of those questions. So as things pop up in your mind, feel free to just drop a question into that Q&A. And most importantly, we'd like you guys to get these two books, and you can do that quite easily by clicking the chat function here. And we're going to keep posting links so you can get those directly through Magic City Books. Magic City Books is a nonprofit bookstore here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Every book you buy supports the work that we do in the community. So you're doing two great things. You're getting wonderful books for yourself, and you're also supporting a good cause. So do that tonight. And like I always say, it's a cheesy line, but I'm just gonna say it anyway. We're doing a special tonight, 2 books for the price of 2. You only get that deal right here. So with that said, I am so excited to enjoy this conversation with the great Mary Jo Bang and Francine Prose. I will hand it off to Mary Jo to get us started, and just say a big thank you to both of you for spending a little bit of time with us tonight.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for having us, and thank you, Francine, for meeting to talk about literature with these two really, I think on the surface look like disparate works of art, but the reason I thought it would be fun to talk is I just keep seeing parallels between the two, even though Dante's work was written, over 700 years ago. When I first, before I even read your new novel, The Vixen, I had read a number of reviews, and I kept hearing that this was about the Cold War era. And then when I started reading it, I thought, this is not about the Cold War era. That's the setting for it. But this is about morality. This is about how to be a decent person. This is about the difficulty of being a decent person. And that I think that it would be like saying, the Divine Comedy is about the Inferno, Purgatorio, and heaven. It's a very reductive way of looking at the structure of a novel, or in this case, a poem. A long poem is to say what it's about instead of what it's doing. Why have we made up this crazy story? And in both cases, they're crazy stories. They begin with these, at first, a reasonable premise. In your case, there's a family watching the news coverage on the night when Ethel and Julius Rosenberg are going to be electrocuted. And in Dante's case, it's a man having a crisis of conscience. It's not delineated, but he says, the right path was lost, and it was as if I were in a dark forest. But then things become unlikely, and they just keep becoming more and more unlikely. So I just thought that maybe we could start by talking about that character as someone who has that stage setting, but who is struggling to reconcile his moral principles with the vexed situation he's found himself in. And how did you devise that vexation for him?
Well, I'm sure you know that it's only after you've written something that you find out what you've written. So as I'm sure you're familiar with, I just felt that I was writing and telling a story, and then later I went back, and it's exactly what you're saying. I mean, what I have been thinking and what I've been saying is that what interested me was the whole question of how you develop a conscience, how you learn to distinguish right from wrong. And certainly, I mean, that runs all the way through the Inferno and Paradiso. I mean, what happens to you, for example, if you don't develop a conscience, and how you can spend an eternity of regret and pain for the conscience that you failed to develop, and how observing all this gives Dante a kind of window into the incredibly complex ways in which you can and won't and can't fail in your ability to live as a moral, decent person in the world.
And what about Simon Putnam?
Well, Simon, my narrator, Simon, is a recent Harvard graduate, Jewish, lives in Coney Island, middle-class parents, gets a job, complicated circumstances, gets a job at a very tony, old-fashioned publishing house. This is the 50s, this is 1953, 1954. And his mother, as was my mother, was a high school friend of Ethel Rosenberg. So the novel begins with the family, as you said, watching the news coverage of the Rosenberg execution. And when Simon goes to work for this publisher, apparently by coincidence, the first real job he's given is to edit this sleazy, lurid, horrendous, ideally bestseller based on the Rosenberg case, in which Ethel is portrayed as this nymphomaniac, Mata Hari, seducing Russians, Americans, and so forth. So, and he knows it's wrong. He knows it's wrong. I mean, that's what I was saying about a conscience. He knows that this is betraying every value he has, every value his family has, but he also has ambition, and he wants a career, and he wants the approval of the people he's working for, and he wants, even more important, I think, he wants access into a world that's very different from the world he's grown up in. So all the way through, he's balancing his desires and his ambition with his sense of what's morally excusable and inappropriate. So talk a little bit about how that plays out in Dante. I mean, how that struggle for conscience and morality and so forth.
Right. I was thinking about what was Simon Putnam's flaw compared to Dante's. And the thing that came to my mind was pride. And one of the first pages of your novel, on page 7, while they're watching, the mother says something, "Look, Simon, it's Jean-Paul Sartre. Hush now, quiet, listen." And then from Simon's mind, why is Sartre at Lucy and Ricky Ricardo's, which is what they're looking at on the television, I Love Lucy. But wait, no, he's in Paris in a book-lined study. And how does mom recognize Sartre? I can never let my parents suspect what a snob I've become. My mother's a teacher. She knows who Sartre is. What did I do at college that raised me so far above them? And I just thought, there it is, you know, and that he has to maintain this self-identification. And that seems to me the essence of pride, is a self-concern that pushes out every other concern and kind of trumps that. And in Dante, the Purgatorio is arranged that there's a first level ante-purgatory, A-N-T-E, which is the antechamber where people wait 30 times the length of the time they delayed accepting God's help. And so if you're 70 years old, 30 times 70 years, you have to sit there waiting and think about what's going to happen. And then you begin going up these 7 circles and spending a certain amount of time on each based on how much you experienced that sin or that offense when you were alive. But everyone has to spend time on the first circle, which is the circle of pride. And the punishment, in order to make you realize the power of what you've done, it becomes concrete. Literally, they have to walk around with boulders on their shoulders that are so heavy, they're squashed down like corbels, those little carved men and women that hold up, you know, the beams of churches. And they walk squat like that with the weight, depending on how much weight, how much pride they suffered. And later, when Dante gets to the circle of envy, which is where their eyes are sewn shut because they looked on things with envy, and now they have to stop doing that to start realizing what they were doing. And someone says, well, when you're up here, that's going to happen to you. And Dante says, I don't think I'll be spending that much time here, but I'm really worried. I can already feel the boulders on my shoulders. And so he's pointing out which, you know, in a kind of self-awareness, which shortcomings he's going to have to pay for. And he does this throughout Inferno and Purgatorio, but it's an accumulative realization that you begin to see over time what he's really worried about. And he's really worried about lust and greed and pride, and not so much envy, not so much what's called sloth, which is a kind of spiritual lassitude. But he knows himself and he implicates himself. But he also, when he has these opportunities, he'll say, oh yeah, I see what you're talking about. I too am going to have to pay for that. But tell me more about that guy up ahead of you. And he's doing exactly what the other penitents are doing. They're still there because they really are not evolved. And it's only when they become evolved that they can go up to the next level. And later in Canto 24, you only learn there that nobody gives you a test. It's when you know you're ready to go on. And that's kind of, I really took that seriously as how hard it is to come to terms with these, our foibles, and then to feel like we have, in fact, have such a deep realization of it that we can let it go. And so as I kept reading the novel, I was trying to watch this pride. And of course, Simon becomes very proud of being able to go out with Anya. Is it Anya Partridge? And in the limousine and have sex with her and all of these things, which are feeding his idea of who he wants to be, that prideful idea of, man about town, successful, in charge.
Yeah, wasn't pride the worst of the 7 deadly sins? I think that was supposed to be the worst. And I've always sort of wondered about that. I mean, if it were up to me to reorder them, let's say, I would put greed, I think. I mean, given the world we live in today, well, perhaps greed and pride would be right up there together. But well, certainly.
I think they're hard to tease apart.
Yeah.
But so the 7 are pride, envy, anger, but it's called wrath, because it's not just anger, it's vengeful anger. And then sloth / laziness, spiritual indifference, and then avarice or greed. And then it actually includes the opposite of greed, which is kind of being a spendthrift and throwing it all away. The idea of all of these things is in moderation. And then there's gluttony, which is a form of excess, eating, drinking, all kinds of other various indulgences. And then the last one is lust. But again, lust is healthy, necessary, but it's only when it's excess. And in all of these things, so pride is necessary, envy is normal, anger is normal, and probably in some situations good. And so it's that when they go too far, that's the problem. And I think that is something that you learn as you go through Purgatorio, and the same with greed, that there is Cerberus, I think it is, in Inferno, is this greedy dog with the 3 heads. And at that point, Virgil might be saying he's the worst. And so people take away that idea that greed is the worst. But, in Inferno, greed is not the worst circle. The worst circle is betrayal.
Betrayal. I know. And I was thinking about that in terms of the Vixen as well. I mean, because that is the fear underlying all the fears, is of betraying everything you've been raised to believe, of betraying your parents, of betraying your value, and who is it? It's like Judas, and who's in that circle? It's Judas and Ptolemy, right? Cleopatra's brother, who killed his mentor, and I can't remember, but he's in that circle. I mean, there are 3 of them that are down there together.
Well, there are actually 3 circles within that circle. Those who betrayed their country, those who betrayed their political party and family, and then the last and worst is those who betrayed invited guests, because you make yourself so vulnerable by going into someone's house, and particularly an overnight guest. You go to sleep. You can be murdered in your bed, you can be poisoned at dinner. So to be betrayed in those situations is the most diabolical, and that's the one that's closest to Satan himself, who's, frozen into a block of ice. So yeah, I think that
weeping his frozen tears out of 6 eyes, right?
And chewing on three men in
Right.
is three different heads. Yeah. And the men have been chewed down to they have no more skin. So the exquisite pain. And always there's this in hell, this exquisite pain. And what's interesting with Purgatorio is that because there's hope, that modifies that pain. It's when you have no hope of the pain ever ending that it's really excruciating. And those in hell, because they can't admit to their wrongs, are going to stay there forever. Whereas in purgatory, you at least have your hope. And you may get up there in time to heaven, where you're never sad, and all of your bad memories are erased, and all of the good ones refreshed. So
Sounds good.
doesn't it? It sounds great.
Sounds great. One thing I was thinking about it is how both of us must have, I know I did, but you also must have confronted at some point the circularity of time. I mean, the way in which the things that Dante was talking about, or the things that happened during Cold War, have come back. They keep coming back. I mean, as Charlie Manson used to say, whatever goes around comes around. I mean, it's certainly true. And I was wondering what it was like working on Dante in the now. I mean, presumably, when did you start, Mary Jo? When did you start doing the Inferno?
I started, Inferno, I started in 2005 and published it in 2005 and in 2012, in 2012. And then I started Purgatorio right before Inferno came out, but then I let it sit for a couple of years and started again in 2014 and finished now. So it's been 15 years totally of working on all of this. But yeah, because it deals with human nature, and I think that's what I kept seeing too in these two works, is we're talking about what it is to be a human being and what human beings struggle with. And the setting can change, and it becomes a parallel universe. We take these details and create this sense of verisimilitude by having a television set, having those things on the television set. Dante does the same thing. He has a lot of cultural touchstones that make that world familiar to his readers at that time. And as you know, I occasionally substitute something from our era to give the sense that this is an ongoing story, and that it's not just a quaint literary artifact, but that in fact, hell is continuing. And as Sartre said, hell is, the others, other people. So nothing changes. And that's also why I wanted to make a translation that answers that question. You have a wonderful essay in LitHub about writing things with clarity. And you say you ask students to ask themselves, how would you say this if you were saying it? And so that's how I've approached this translation, is how would someone say this? And because in Dante's original, he is saying, and yes, he's using rhyme and he's using the three lines, but he's saying in a way that people understand what he's saying. And people are so excited by what he's saying that they learn the Tuscan dialect so that they can read it. And so if you twist that language into something that seems archaic, then it's not going to be clear, because yes, we wouldn't say it that way. And so that's what I've tried to do, is to put it in the way we would say it. But to do that.
So how did your sense of the timeliness of it change as the world around us changed? I mean, did it come to seem more and more a word I hate I'm about to use, relevant to the moment? Or
I think it especially did in Purgatorio because whenever he's talking about the politics of Italy, you he's describing a dysfunctional country with all of these fractured groups. And as our world has become more and more partisan, you could see the echoes so plainly. And in Canto 6 of Purgatorio, there's so many moments. Let me see if I can find one that just sound like we're talking about our country. So he's saying, he's going on about how everybody's fighting with each other, and he says, come and see the people, how they love one another. If pity for us, and he's speaking to Italy. And if pity for us doesn't move you, come out of shame for how your name will be remembered. And if one is allowed to ask, O Jove on high, who was crucified on earth for us, are your righteous eyes turned elsewhere? Or are you preparing something fine in the council chamber of your unfathomable mind that we can't grasp because of our brokenness? Every town and city in Italy is swarming with tyrants, and every partisan chucklehead comes to play the part of Marcellus. And Florence, my own, you should be happy with this digression, which, thanks to your people and how they handle matters, doesn't concern you. Many have justice in their hearts, but are slow. The arrow keeps asking the bow for advice, but your mouth is filled to the brim with it. Many refuse the burden of public office, but you, even before being asked, hoist the weight and cry like the little red hen, I will, I will, I will. And he goes on, Athens and Sparta framed the ancient laws and modeled what it was to be civilized, only hinting at what the good life might be, unlike you people who so narrowly define your steps that the hairs you split in October fray and break by mid-November. And of course, I'm doing this right before the November election.
yeah,
So these ironies of the correspondences. And then he asks, how often in your memory have you modified your laws, currency, precedents, and policies, and thrown people out and brought others in? And of course, all during the Trump era, people would come and stay for a month, 6 months, a year, and then out on their thumbs. If you think carefully at the past, you'll see you're like the princess and the pea, 20 feather beds atop 20 mattresses, and yet no rest. Pain makes her toss and turn all night. So, I'm sitting there and have the news in your head. You can't get it out of your head because it's so unlikely and so unnerving that, yes, there are just moment after moment after moment.
Yeah, no, writing about the Cold War era, I was continually startled by how much it seemed like the moment in which I was writing it. There were threads that went through. For example, McCarthy's henchman, Roy Cohn, the horror Zelig of the 20th century reappears as Donald J. Trump's mentor, et cetera, et cetera. But beyond that, the ferocious partisanship and the distrust and the paranoia and the suspicion and the way in which people were found guilty of this and that without trial, the way in which rumor was enough to convict someone, the way in which lives were casually ruined on the basis of someone's suspicion. Really, it all seemed so so horribly current that it made it. And also, I began to think. This was a book that I'd been trying to write for a very long time. I I have 14 drafts of the beginning, stacks of paper that just was like, I kept throwing out because it was so awful. And what I began to think was that living in the moment in which I was living made it possible to work my way imaginably back to the moment which I was writing about, because as I said, the similarities were so eerie and so evocative and powerful that it was just seemed astonishing that 60 years could have gone by until 60, 70 years could have gone by until since then.
Well, and also that whole idea of the duplicity of the novel. After Wag the Dog, that film, we know that anything can be invented and given a kind of authority that suddenly it becomes believed. And so this novel that is supposedly, out there, that is going to both be a bestseller, but also implicate Ethel in a way that isn't clear. There's great ambiguity about whether or not she has any guilt, and certainly whether that guilt should make her deserve the electric chair. And I don't even think there's a question anymore about that, and that how she was used to try to make Julius confess is now known. And so this idea of these are ongoing things. Yes, you've made a satire and you've turned the heat up under reality and made it slightly less likely than reality. But that, it seems to me, what satire is you take this premise that is possible and then make it slightly unlikely. My colleague at WashU, the fiction writer, David Schumann, calls it the snowball structure. So you take this, this thing and then start going with it and see how far you can go with it. And I felt like that was a perfect description of Dante, because we start with this premise, man's having an existential crisis, and everything could be metaphorically in the real world. He encounters these three, animals, which could be, your doubts or whatever. And it only becomes unrealistic when he meets the Roman poet Virgil. And the same thing with the Vixen is, it's perfectly reasonable that this young man who's just finished at Harvard is sitting with his parents in this apartment in near Coney Island, watching this thing on television. And then he gets a job, and then suddenly things become less reasonable and they become more and more unreasonable, where the supposed author is living in a mental institution and can leave anytime she wants, and etc.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are all these, or let's say semi-absurd things that happen all the way through. And then it circles back around to a kind of horrible historical reality, which was the cultural Cold War and the way in which cultural products were used to advance soft power throughout the world and provide a kind of cover for the really awful things that we were doing around the world at that same time.
I think it takes a great bravado, though, both to take this unlikely premise and go with it as you did, because they're real historical figures. And I think that's why I didn't want people saying this is about the Cold War. It's set in the Cold War. It's not about that, because you're not adhering to the facts of that. You're using them, but you're using them and pushing them. And with Dante too, this is a ridiculous story. A man goes down 9 circles of hell, confronts Satan in a block of ice, makes his way down his hairy legs to the middle of the earth. So, but the fact is that satire, and I think that's why Dante called this a comedy, because that was the tradition, is a comedy as a satire. and he knew what he was doing, and he was turning the heat up under our expectations about how things work, in order to better help us to see how things work.
Yeah. I mean, and also taking advantage of, I mean, I was thinking about this reading your translation, and of taking advantage of how theatrical life was and how theatrical Dante is. I mean, it's so dramatic at every level. I mean, it just keeps kind of in so many different ways, like jacking up the level of theatricality as he goes through the circles and rises back again.
Well, and I think some of that has to do with detail and the use of detail, and some of it has to do with characters and what you put in the mouth of characters.
Mhm.
And all of these characters, once you relax the translation and let them just speak their words, begin to take on the personality that they're meant to have. And the same is true in these characters. So, Warren Landry has a very particular way of talking to people, and particularly talking to Simon and Elaine, his assistant. And so the believability, no matter how, crazy the plot gets, it's still believable, because this is how people talk and this is how people act in general.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Warren and speaking of believability and how people talk, for me, always one of the most pleasurable things about writing fiction is to let characters just rant, just like wind them up and let them go. I mean, there's a scene where all the pieces kind of come together, so to speak, and he just rants about what's happened, which was my favorite part of writing the novel. But there's a lot of that in Dante too, because all Dante has to do is ask a question to someone he meets, and it's just like blah 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 blah. So that must have been great fun to write, to just channel their voices in a way and just go with it.
Yeah, no, and I think that because the language is so colloquial, that some people suspect I've put in a lot more than I have. I mean, yes, I do put in Wall Street at one point, because the substitution is that Dante says it was like an abandoned street. And so I say it was like Wall Street on the weekend. And that's one of those moments where I want the contemporary world to be reflected, so that hell seems a part of our world. But I don't go that far out to say Wall Street on the weekend compared to an abandoned road. And yet I think a lot of people think I add a lot more than I do, but these are the stories that these people tell. And they're heartrending, particularly to Dante. Sometimes, in Inferno, he faints after hearing Francesca and Paolo and the story of their love. So he's very moved by all of these things, because he can see, I think, how easy it is to fall into these kinds of situations, and particularly a situation like lust, which he identifies as one of his major problems. And then he has this confrontation with Beatrice at the end, where she confronts him almost like a dominatrix, and really punishes him for having gone after some young thing, which is exactly what Dante says, and some fly-by-night, young thing, instead of thinking about her and how he had loved her, and that kind of pure love. And so there's both the self-implication in that, so that he's not above everyone else, but he's also telling us about how to be a human being. And you have to admit your own foibles to convince someone that you know what it is to be a human being. I wanted to ask about the Beatrice question, because one of the things I was thinking about the Vixen is that Simon has no guide. He has no Virgil like Dante does. And when Dante gets to the terrestrial heaven, which is the top of Mount Purgatory, the old Eden, and he's about to be able to go to paradise, that's where the guidance is transferred from Virgil. Since he's pagan, he can't go into paradise of any form. And then Beatrice takes over. But Simon has no guide. But at the end, by aligning himself with Julia, who is sort of outside the story for most of it, he's able to realize his best self. So what does he want? Dante wants knowledge. He thinks knowledge will save us. And he thinks a guide can get you there. How does that work for Simon in terms of how does he get knowledge?
Well, he's young. I mean, I kept thinking all the way through, he's young. And part of the pleasure and the difficulty of writing the book was working my way back to that time, which is still very vivid to me, but I had to, what it's like when you just graduate from college and you're supposed to have a life and you don't have a life and you have no idea. So you don't really know what you want. What does he want? He wants happiness. He wants work. He wants, he wants love and work, what everybody wants. And finally, not a spoiler, gets it. But I don't think it's exactly true that he doesn't have a guide. I mean, a friend of mine said that the Vixen is, it's a novel about a guy who loves his mother, and not in a pathological way. I mean, not like Alex Portnoy. I mean, he really, and that's very rare. I mean, a character, or actually a living human being, but a character who likes hanging out with his parents, who likes going, and his mother's voice is in his head. So part of his agony really is having that voice in his head, the voice of conscience, really, of her conscience that's being transposed through generations, having that voice in his head and trying to do something that he knows is wrong with that voice constantly telling him that it's just a bad idea. So it's an inner voice, not an outer guide, but it's still, and the way we all do. I mean, we know when we're about to do something shady, ever so slightly shady, we know, and yet for whatever reason we continue.
Yeah, we're weak. But also there are realities. He needs a job because otherwise he has to, sleep on his parents' sofa and have his father, or even just, he would have his father buying his food. So, I think that those moments, that's part of the difficulty of being a moral person, is that we're often in situations where to stand up is at great cost. You can lose your job, you can lose your housing. These are real things. And so it's not just always choosing what you know is right. It's also having a certain kind of security to allow you to do the right thing.
Yeah, well, his challenge, is to be a whistleblower, really. And he finds a kind of clever end run around being a whistleblower, but nonetheless, that's finally what he does. I mean, takes the moral position that he knows he needs to take regardless of, and then, lucks out because finds another way of leading a life without those people in that world.
But he also finds Julia, and I think that is also, maybe that is also part of being able to be good, is to have a community, even if it's a community of one, to support you, that it's very hard to act on your own. And I think that even is a little bit about what's going on with the Rosenbergs themselves, is that Ethel has the opportunity to they both do implicate other people and be spared death, and they refuse to do it.
Right.
And so I think and they are only, Ethel and Julius at that point are their only community, and they have to stick together. But I think that that's a key in terms of doing good. And I think that it's really difficult if you don't have that.
Yeah.
I,
Speaking
yeah.
Speaking of Paolo and Francesca, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about sympathy, about questions of sympathy. And in fact, my class that I'm teaching in Bard in next week, at the end of the week, is about sympathy and about how writers create sympathy for fictional character. I mean, the class is called Sympathy for the Devil, although it's not actually about the devil. So, and I was thinking about Dante, about his response to that story, and how our sympathy for Dante grows in proportion to his sympathy for Francesca, and the way in which, the way in which Dante augments and complicates the reader's sympathy for the character who is him by playing with those factors all the way through.
Yeah, no, and that continues. And there's another aspect to that with Virgil, because often Virgil will scold Dante for having sympathy for someone. So when they're in the foyer of hell, where these people are running after this banner that is blowing this way and that and won't take a stand, these are people who were cowards when they had the right or the ability to stand up for right, and they didn't. So Virgil says they did nothing right and nothing wrong. Heaven doesn't want them, because if they were, hell doesn't want them, because if they went to hell, the truly bad would gloat, saying, oh, we're worse than you. And they don't want to create a situation of pleasure for the truly sinful. So they have to stay in this foyer forever, racing, crying, tears going down, feeding maggots at their feet for all of time, for just not standing up. And Virgil and Dante is really moved by them. And Virgil says, nah, look at them and then let's go. They're not worth your time. So there's the human side, and then this other, now he's dead, and he doesn't have that sympathy. He has higher standards in a sense, but he's also no longer human and able to feel how difficult it is to stand up for things. I also found all these in all these correspondences, this really interesting correspondence at the end of both the novel, because Simon Putnam is up in the air, heaven, and Dante is about to rise up to heaven. And I wondered if, I thought that it wasn't clear what's going to happen. I mean, there were two possibilities. One was that Simon's fear of this parachute ride at Coney Island, he would drop and die, or he would land. And so the Earth is coming up to meet them, is either they're coming down and landing safely, or the other. But at the time he's saying, let me just live and write this book the right way. And Beatrice is saying to Dante, I want you to go back to Earth and write this book, write everything you saw and write it exactly as it happened. And those parallels were kind of eerie. And I wondered if you had Dante in your mind, consciously or unconsciously.
Oop, I think we may have frozen
Frozen, oh no.
That's all right. While we do that though, let me jump to a couple of questions for Mary Jo real quick. So we do have a question here from one of our viewers, specifically for you, Mary Jo, which is from a viewer, Andrea, who says, how do you balance the accuracy of the original text with empathy, approachability, and the original spirit of the text in your translation of the work? in other spaces, what kind of space must you inhabit to become a vessel for translation?
Oh, those are two separate questions. Repeat the first question.
How do you balance the accuracy of the original text with the empathy and approachability of what you're doing in your translation?
The first thing I do is a literal translation, and I hold myself to a standard where I use every word if I can. Now, sometimes I'll look at other translations and I'll see that they have let go certain words, and it might be that, you know, there are so many ways of saying the same thing that you don't have to have that word in there. But because of my own imposter syndrome, I feel like I have to. So I make sure all those words are in there. It's a literal translation. And then I start playing with the translation to make it more that thing that we were talking about before, is how would I say this? Or how would Dante say this if Dante were speaking contemporary American English? And so in that transition, there are many steps. So I'll do that and I'll think I've gotten it. And then I'll let that sit as I do the next canto. And then I come back to it and I think, oh my God, no, I can go so much farther. Because look at this person. It's almost, he's a great Dantist. He taught at Princeton forever. And, you know, he's almost paraphrased it. And look at the attention to detail I've given it. But can't I relax a little bit more now, because I don't want it to sound like a translation. So that's when I try to bring in that kind of energy that Dante gave it. And so that's how I do that, is to come back again and again and again, getting it closer and closer to how would this be said in a way that carries the reader along, that tells the reader how somebody's feeling and what the meaning is, but also what the subjectivity is. And then what was the second part?
The second question was more about what kind of space you inhabit when you're doing translation, meaning I guess what that would mean is, you know, do you feel like you have to kind of become a certain person when you're doing that, or you have to kind of get in a certain mindset when it's time to do that work? And is that work different than when you're sitting down and writing poetry or prose or whatever you're doing?
Yeah, I think that I've gotten to know Dante very well now, 15 years, think about it, almost every day, me and Dante. And so I feel like I can slip into that space pretty easily, and then I can walk away from it, come back and do it again. You know, maybe it's like being having a partner. You know, you walk in and you're who you are with that partner, and then you go out and you're somebody slightly different, but of course the same you too. So I think that over time that has just become a comfortable zone.
One more follow-up for that is when Inferno came out, we mentioned, you know, that was 2012. So that's been, you know, going on a decade ago. You obviously were immersed in this project, and translations change. Obviously, translations can be done by anyone, and there's, you know, a lot of different translations. Do you look back on that work differently than even when it came out now? When you look back at the work you did on Inferno, in terms of like, would you translate it differently now if you were starting from scratch?
I ask myself that a lot, because I've gotten better at being able to be closer to the original, and yet do those things that I want to do, make it vernacular, make it alive, make it radical, make it in this voice that I've created in American English. And I think that because I started this on a lark, I was taking a lot of liberties in the beginning of Inferno, and it was only over time that I decided to try to meet this challenge of being a true translator. So I went back and rewrote a lot of the early parts, but I left a couple of things there that are truly push the envelope a little too far. Robert Prog Harrison, in his review in the New York review of books said she makes occasionally unforced errors. And I like that because yes, they are unforced. I didn't have to make those errors. So I often wonder if I do finish Paradiso, which I've begun, and this all comes out as one book, whether I would go back to that early Purgatorio and make some adjustments, or should it just stay? Those were the footprints. And that's how I came to however I get to the end. So I don't know.
Francine, when you're working on a project like the Vixen, and obviously it's rooted in such fact and history, do you ever think about the fact that does the book need to stand alone? Meaning, if you gave the book to somebody and they had no sense of whether it was based on anything that happened or not, they had no sense of history or anything, that the book should stand totally by itself as the story? And does that have any impact on how you write a book like that?
Well, I mean, the good or bad news is that practically no one I've met under 30 knows what happened anyway. So I had a complete clean slate here. And also, I mean, I have a number of friends who are immigrants who came to this country late, who came to this country after the 50s, and smart, well-educated, well-informed politically, who don't know about the Rosenberg. So it wasn't as if I was ever dealing with something that I imagined everybody knew about. So I had to, so one of the tricks of writing something like that is you've got to like sneak little bits of exposition in so that they don't seem like exposition, so that someone, I mean, for example, the fact that the government's main piece of evidence against the Rosenbergs was this Jello box that was, cut it as a jigsaw puzzle, and that the two spies got together and said the Rosenberg sent me by hooking up this two, which was like patently absurd. I mean, no one, but when my son, who was one of my earliest readers, read it, he had absolutely, and he's in his 39, he had absolutely no idea that such a thing was possible, that this had ever happened. So in a way, I could have been, I mean, a horrible way, I could have been making it up because it came as news to so many people.
And, there's a new biography of Ethel Rosenberg just out, I believe, in the last few weeks even. If someone were to read the book and that was kind of their entry point to the topic totally, I think one nice thing I love when I find a novel, for example, that maybe is about a slice of history that I don't know much about, and then it kind of leads me down a path to want to know more about that. What would be like the first book you would suggest someone read if they want to kind of go deeper down that rabbit hole? Because I'm sure you read a zillion books about it.
Well, there's so many rabbit holes that you could go down. I mean, a couple. I mean, one that comes to mind is there's a book called Legacy of Ashes by Tim Weiner that's about the CIA and what they did in that. And I've been obsessed with that book since I read it. I mean, I suppose it's a bit of a spoiler to say how connected it is to what I wrote, but I've for a long time been looking for a way to talk about the cultural Cold War and the way, as I said, cultural products were used. So that, and also it's just fascinating. But then there's a great, I mean, it's hard to get, but there was a wonderful film by Emile D'Antonio called Point of Order, which was just about the Army McCarthy hearings. And the film, it's transcribed, so you can get a transcription of it. And the dramatic moments from the hearings, I mean, Joseph Welch's "Have you no decency, sir" moment is very much, so it brings you back, and any of the biographies of McCarthy, for example, are fascinating and incredibly useful for understanding what happened then.
Okay, so Legacy of Ashes is the book. Okay. Last question, Mary Jo, because we're about out of time here, which is this. I often ask this of poets. Now that you've spent so much time doing this work as translator and you know all these things, I always wonder about how you think about yourself in terms of identity, because a poet in some ways is such a unique identity in the world of writing, whereas a novelist has kind of an identity, but the poets I know really think of themselves as poets kind of first. That's kind of the first hat they put on. Has this project kind of changed the way you think of yourself in a professional capacity, or just generally, like, are you a poet still first at heart, and how do you kind of define that?
I think it's been a gradual thing. And while I translated Purgatorio, I did two other translations over the same period of time. One with a native Japanese speaker, Yuki Tanaka. We translated together a book of poems by a surrealist Japanese poet, Shuzo Takaguchi, and he wrote between 1927 and 1937. And we've translated that entire book. And then on my own, with a little help from the living poet, Matthias Goritz, I've translated a book of his poems from German. And so by the time I finished Purgatorio, I felt like, you know what, maybe I can now think of myself as a poet and translator. And the other day I was asked to write a very short biography for a poem that was coming out in a magazine. And I dared to say Mary Jo Bang is a poet and translator. And I think that's the first time I did that.
Yeah, well, it certainly applies. And I can't thank both of you enough for spending some time with us and having such a fascinating conversation. I do hope everyone watching will read both of these books. Like I said, there's chat links here to make that really easy for you to get those. And you're just going to have such an immersive experience in both of these worlds. I mean, such different places to go. But as you heard tonight, the overlapping themes are abundant. So thank you, Francine. Thank you, Mary Jo. Best wishes to both of you. Stay safe, take care, and we hope to see you very soon. Same to all of you for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mary Jo.
Thank you, Francine. Love seeing you again.
Too.